It's typical of a rebuilding team to begin their rebuild by drafting their quarterback of the future. Very rarely do we see teams do it any other way. For example, the Cleveland Browns selected their edge rusher of the future before drafting their quarterback of the future a year later. The Kansas City Chiefs began their rebuild with selecting a left tackle in the 2013 NFL Draft, and then trading for their bridge quarterback before inevitably drafting their heir to that bridge QB. But in specific cases, we see teams go very far lengths in order to secure that right individual to put under center. The Arizona Cardinals went 2 straight NFL drafts with selecting a quarterback in the first round, while the New York Jets are on the cusp of selecting another quarterback with the #1 overall pick in this year's NFL draft, despite failing to surround their previous top 3 QB, who was supposed to be the savior of their franchise, with adequate pieces in order to help him develop. The Cincinnati Bengals recently drafted Joe Burrow and put him in a phenomenal position where he did have a below-average offensive line, but he did have a decent supporting cast in terms of weapons at the running back position and the wide receiver position. While the Miami Heat built an identity based off of playing very tough and hard-nosed defense and really rallied behind their second-year head coach, Brian Flores, before inevitably putting Tua Tagovailoa under center. But in the case of the Detroit Lions, they're in a situation that is truly unique. Having selected a quarterback with the #1 overall pick in the 2009 NFL Draft, 2 years after they drafted their superstar wide receiver, a transcendent talent by the name of Calvin Johnson, #2 overall in the 2007 NFL Draft. So what's going on, guys? Mike here, and today we're going to be discussing the weird situation that Matthew Stafford is currently in. Before we get to the content, I just wanted to let you guys know that we're giving away a PlayStation 5 to anyone that leaves a like on this video, subscribes, and turns on our notifications, whether you're an old subscriber or a new subscriber. If you want an additional entry, follow us on Instagram and on Twitter. Now that we got all that out of the way, break! When the Detroit Lions selected Matthew Stafford with the #1 overall pick in the 2009 NFL Draft, they were starting over from absolutely nothing, having won only 0 games the year prior with a quarterback that was a shell of his former self under center. The Detroit Lions had some work to do. In the 2009 NFL Draft, they drafted not only their quarterback of the future, but they selected their tight end of the future, found a stud in Lou Delmas, and also was able to find a diamond in the rough in DeAndre Levy in the 3rd round. On top of that, they hired Jim Schwartz as their new head coach, who was a defensive-minded head coach. Bear that in mind because you're going to spot a trend here. Matthew Stafford's first year under center was probably the worst season he's ever had in his entire career, throwing for 13 touchdowns and 20 interceptions and only completing 53% of his passes. I mean, the ship wasn't going to get righted right away, so this provided the Detroit Lions to look towards the other side of the ball. In the 2010 NFL Draft, they drafted their pass rusher of the future, Ndamukong Suh. But you see, as time progressed forward, there was something that the Detroit Lions proved to all of us NFL fans, that they were pretty much playing roulette when it came to their roster transactions and their personnel decisions. You see, in the 2011 NFL Draft, they drafted players like Nick Fairley, Titus Young, and Mikel LeSure, all in the first 2 rounds, and all of them didn't really stick around, which is pretty strange considering the fact that they had Ndamukong Suh on the roster already. They could have easily drafted a player like Robert Quinn or Ryan Kerrigan or Cameron Jordan, Muhammad Wilkerson, or Cameron Hayward even would make sense. That draft was completely packed with edge rushing talent, and at the time, the Detroit Lions desperately needed an edge rusher to pair with Ndamukong Suh. Nevertheless, they would put up their two most successful seasons following this, going 10-6 in the regular season behind the tandem of Calvin Johnson and Matthew Stafford, as Calvin Johnson would begin to frequently break NFL receiving records, eventually giving us one of the greatest NFL seasons we've ever had the pleasure of watching in 2012, when he had almost 2,000 yards receiving in one season. But everything would come crashing down after 2012. Nick Fairley would fall off of a cliff, the player that they did draft in 2011, which he did make it to a second-team All-Pro selection, by the way, so I should show him love for that. But throughout strange personnel decisions and subpar NFL drafts, if there's been one picture of consistency, it was Matthew Stafford and Calvin Johnson. Now, don't get me wrong, in the earlier parts of his career, Matthew Stafford wasn't necessarily the greatest when it came to pass accuracy. Not until the Detroit Lions opted to move away from the defense-first Jim Schwartz and brought in probably their best head coach of the Matthew Stafford era, Jim Caldwell. You see, a mere one season after they decided to move past Jim Schwartz and opt for Jim Caldwell in 2014, in 2015, we saw Matthew Stafford's completion percentage jump up by a whole 7%. And finally, after years and years of shoddy drafts with players like Amir Abdullah and Eric Ebron and Kyle Van Noy, who is a great player, just not for the Detroit Lions, Martin Mayhew was finally fired as the general manager of the Detroit Lions, and Bob Quinn was brought in. Well, the poor NFL draft decisions continued. Calvin Johnson even admitted to the fact that he lost his love for football as a result of playing with the Detroit Lions, and he retired prematurely as a result of his career with the Detroit Lions. He said that he was so worn down from his time there that he just couldn't play it. He doesn't even watch football anymore. That's how much he doesn't like it anymore. When your culture alienates quite possibly one of the greatest wide receivers of all time, or a player that could have challenged the likes of Jerry Rice, Randy Moss, and Terrell Owens for that title should he have had more longevity, well, that's when you know you have a bit of a culture problem. But on top of that, the Detroit Lions weren't doing a good job drafting players and adding players and hiring coaches. They drafted players like Taylor Decker, who has been solid for the Detroit Lions and still plays for them until this day. But 2 picks later, you had Ryan Kelly, who would eventually make a Pro Bowl for the Indianapolis Colts. Hell, if you jump a couple spots higher, you quite possibly could have traded for Laramie Tunsil. In 2017, they would draft players like Jared Davis and Tease Tabor, who haven't been anything that special, but in the 3rd round, they found a diamond in the rough in Kenny Golladay. In 2018, they drafted Frank Ragnow, who is now famous for playing with a fractured throat, until drafting their 3rd tight end in the Matthew Stafford era in the 1st round with TJ Hawkinson in 2019, and drafting Jeffrey Okudah and DeAndre Swift in the first 2 rounds. And by the way, in his first season so far, Jeffrey Okudah is getting, let's say, below average numbers. So what's the point here? Well, the Detroit Lions are rumored to want to move on from Matthew Stafford, and it doesn't necessarily make sense for them as an organization, if you ask me, more as it is just a kindness to Matthew Stafford, because throughout all of this mediocrity, if there has been one player that has been consistent through it all, it's been Matthew Stafford with his 278 touchdowns, 143 interceptions, a sub-500 record, and a 63% completion percentage. Stafford has thrown for 44,547 yards, and the Detroit Lions are in a situation where they clearly have a very good quarterback. Like, Matthew Stafford isn't average, he's not above average, he is without a doubt one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. But the reason why nobody knows that is because his talent is being wasted away on mediocre Detroit Lions teams. Adam Schefter had this to say about the reported Matthew Stafford trade rumors, saying, "Knowing what I know, I don't think he's going to have the stomach to really go through another rebuilding job. He might want to go and play for a team that is ready to win now. So I think that's an unsettled, fluid situation." Now, it's no shock to anyone. This is one of the more interesting off seasons in NFL history because in the past, you wouldn't typically see a lot of teams that are a quarterback away from contention. You wouldn't see teams like the Indianapolis Colts that are a QB away from winning a Super Bowl. You wouldn't see a team that would do whatever it takes to potentially bring in a quarterback from an opposing team because the NFL essentially tries to phase those situations out by implementing things like the franchise tag. But recently, over the past decade, we've seen scenarios such as Peyton Manning signing with the Denver Broncos in the latter part of his career to win a Super Bowl, and Tom Brady joining the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in order to have a more prolific offense in the latter part of his career. Now this year's big fish is Matthew Stafford, and this year's ideal landing spot for any quarterback is the Indianapolis Colts, a team with a fantastic offensive line, an established running game, a head coach that clearly knows how to call plays, and a pretty phenomenal defense. Matthew Stafford isn't going to have to do as much carrying, and joining this team could prolong his career. But the problem is he's not necessarily a shoo-in to join the Indianapolis Colts. You see, another player that could be on the trade block for Frank Reich is Carson Wentz, a player that he's already had success with in the past. But there are multiple teams that are literally a QB away from contention. You look at the Chicago Bears, and if Allen Robinson had a legitimate quarterback with a good arm to consistently get him the ball, if Matt Nagy had a quarterback with a strong arm, or if the Denver Broncos had a consistent QB and don't want to necessarily wait on Drew Lock, or even the San Francisco 49ers, who need a quarterback that isn't injured and will probably lean more on their running game as opposed to a QB that could sling the rock. The Detroit Lions have a lot of options as to where to trade Matthew Stafford. And is it the best idea for them as a franchise? No. But is it the right thing for them to do? I'd say so, because there's nothing worse in the NFL than being a middle franchise in the NFL. And if there's anything that the Detroit Lions have proven to us, it's with Matthew Stafford, they're mediocre, and without Matthew Stafford, they're abysmal. And it's way better to be abysmal than it is to be mediocre, especially if you're just not good at drafting players. The Detroit Lions' problem stems further than just the players that are currently on the roster. It's the way that they currently run the operation. Their general managers have always been incompetent and inept. They've decided to move on from a head coach that was clearly succeeding as opposed to waiting for him to develop and ended up making their team even worse. And honestly, I would like to see this former number 1 overall pick eventually break into the playoffs and do some damage. So let me know in the comment section down below who should trade for Matthew Stafford. Aside from that, I'm your boy Mike, and I'm dropping our mic until our next upload.